Okay. And first of all, big thanks to the organizers of this extraordinary conference and your resilience to carry this through 2 years of a global pandemic. I'm very happy to be here with very much appreciated colleagues. And I jump right in because I have a tendency to be too long. And I'm happy to speak today about Emily Carr's library and to investigate in as much as it can be read as a tool of emancipation, finally, and self-education. So if we talk about libraries, we talk about education, and certainly Emily Carr's settler colonial family and this pragmatic education that she had certainly an impact on her relationship to written knowledge, books, and intellectual pursuits in general. It is known that Emily Carr's generation did rarely publish aesthetic series or texts themselves, and they were not expected to either, but to have this creative force supposedly inherent in female artists. And this prejudice is paired with a general anti-intellectualism that dominates the Victorian age. The English idea of the common sense that had been interpreted by Carr's middle and upper class contemporaries as part of a practical nature with a deep respect for facts and a general suspicion of abstract imaginative speculation had kept them from engaging too much into intellectual pursuits. But Victorian women did not have to be an intellectual to transgress their society-given limitations, but that could have happened simply by reading too much, wanting an education, not wanting to get married, or otherwise demanding more freedoms and forms of mobility than those allocated to their gender and class. Only recently, fundamental studies had been conducted to women's libraries. For example, in Germany, a new lexica of women's libraries, not only the still existing ones, but also the lost ones and the disappeared ones, has appeared. And speaking of Emily Carr's private library, is not, you should not imagine it to come into a room like in George O'Keeffe's case where all her books are housed, but there are a collection of books that are housed in the Royal BC Archives, and thanks to Catherine Bridge at the time, I could access and look into these books. If you want to talk about the history of this collection, you have to go back to Emily Carr's last will, where she writes to Ira Dilworth when she's preparing her afterlife. She writes to him, "I'd like you to have any of my books you want. Pick them off my shelves, they will go to the auction rooms. I'd like to take the Whitman, Patanjali, and your anthology that you gave me, and any more you want." From these three aforementioned items, only Walt Whitman made it into the collection of books held at the archives. Today, we have identified 49 items from the Edna Parnell and Flora Burns collections. These are Ira Dilworth's nieces and heiresses that left these books in the late 1980s to the BC archives. What do we have in this collection? We can find poetry from Goethe to Rossetti, of course, Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass in 3 publications. We have books on art and art history, art theory, and complete monographies on the great masters of modernity. A chronology of these books that I undertook show that most of these books came into the possession of Emily Carr after the seminal year of 1927, when Emily Carr traveled for the first time east to Ottawa at the occasion of the opening of the exhibition of Canadian West Coast art, native and modern. That is known to be a life-changing event for Emily Carr. And it is interesting that already in 1990, Doris Schartbold gave a talk on Emily Carr, titled The Thinking Artist, where she has the hypothesis that this event was the moment where she went through an intensified period of learning initiated by the member of the group of 7, here especially Lauren Harris, Mark Tobey, and books, as she said. A thinking artist, what is that? Thinking Carr, so Doris Schartbold, is an intelligent person, an aware and knowledgeable painter, a diligent researcher, and a thoughtful artist, consciously considering what she wanted to say in her art and experimenting, searching for the means to convey it, open and ready to learn from others when appropriate opportunities came her way. And they came, so Shadbolt, in the years 1928, 1929, when Mark Tobey introduced her to Rolf Pearson's How to See Modern Pictures, a work from 1928 that we can find still today in Emily Carr's library. Shadbolt's reading of Emily Carr's library are a combination of connecting biographical events with art historical currents, because Mark Tobey wants Emily Carr to read this book so that she realizes that her painting is connected with the contemporary modern art that thinks of themselves in succession of modernist cubism. This is one way of reading books. There are two ways in general, either to read books as an object that connects two people, or as a medium that connects ideas while these books are written. And a lot has been written about private libraries from important thinkers like Walter Benjamin, Alberto Manguel, or Georges Didier Huberman, that come from a literary tradition where books are used as forms of knowledge exchange between two writers, two thinkers, or two readers. Here on the right, we have another book that in the last 10 years, a research project based in France, talking about artist libraries. That's a project initiated by Ségolène Lemaine in Paris that led to this database that you can visit, the Artist Libraries project, where selected artist libraries had been digitalized and presented to the public, where inventories are offered of complete collections of books, magazines, and catalogs. So the question is, how can we as art historians use those collections, and what questions can we ask ourselves when faced with the collections? For example, why an artist was interested in one book and not the others? Did the artist read the book or not? And how do we know that? These kind of researches to look at the networked reality of artists leads to reconstruct networks of artists with their collectors and gallerists via exhibition catalogs and literature. The problem is that in the case of women artists, these networks had already been at their time a closed network of the so-called boys' club. A second approach that I would like to stress comes from another field than art history, meaning exile research. So in German, we say Exilforschung, which researches the lives of exiled German Jewish intellectuals and their personal libraries. Here, especially Ernst Fischer, he suggests and proposes to treat books as a part of an expanded domestic space, a part of the owner's Umwelt, so his or her environment, that gives proof of her values, knowledge, yes, relationships, but also creativity, affiliation, successes and failures, hopes and disappointments. So he advocates to look at books as objects that tell not only about the owner's self-understanding, but also about his or her understanding of the world, which can lead, of course, to an intellectual biography that you can draw from that. But also we can learn about the idea of education and how the artist was learning. But first of all, you have to start with the objects. And I don't want to spend too much time with theoretical exposés, but I want to have you to have a look. So coming back to Shadbolt's argument that the moment of Emily Carr starting to think would have been in 1928 can be challenged by looking at the library, where we have two art theoretical texts from the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, talks about art and a theory of pure design that she not only possessed and came into her possession at the beginning of the 20th century, but she also worked it through. So you have the idea of pure design here on the right, and you see how Emily Carr was working through the book, underlining, and that throughout the book. Another way of knowing is that we can have a look not only into the text and if the text is worked, but to have a look to the margins of the book. You can see here, I can even see it myself because I have your window, but on the top you should read that she bought this book while in Paris, and at the back of the book we have even the stickers still from Brentanos in Paris, which is important to know that this is an English-speaking bookshop, and we all know that Emily Carr didn't speak French, so she was limited to art theories from the Anglo-Saxon countries, which she read by the time that contemporary currents like Cubism was appearing, so to speak, in real time, but not via French art theory, but via the Anglo-Saxon axis. Another beautiful example what we can learn about her way of approaching learning is another example from later years where she started to assist at writing workshops. So we have here a handbook on how to write short stories, and you can see this is also heavily worked, and you can see here on the top that when she doesn't know words, she's going to look it up, for example, idiomatic, mode of expression peculiar to a language. So you see there is a deep yearning of understanding, working through text, and really getting into relationships.
Excuse me, Elisabeth, you just have about 1 more minute.
Okay, so I now comes she also has lists of books to read that she writes in the back of the books. And then there's, of course, the Walt Whitman that I have to show you. This is the book on the right where she says, to be given to Ira when I die. And this is really a life of a book. The book is alive with photos that are pinned into it, like here on top of the frontispiece, or you have a lot of letters. You have even leaves of grass that were put into the pages of the same poem. You have also Emily Carr fangirling about Ira Dilworth that he calls Emily's Ira Dilworth. And here you can see this book has lived with her for many years. You see here marks of usage. And the last example that I want to show you is not only friendships and passion for poetry, but also a reflection. And that's what we were talking in our panel about, a self-positioning. So when Emily Carr was on her way back from her London sojourn in 1905, she has a book with her where she was drawing in the front. And I don't know if you can read it. There's one woman reading a journal called The Province, and the other one called The World. So you can see modernism inside and out are really also to be taken literally here. And you see that Emily Carr herself, she reflected on her own position moving in between those two worlds.